At the age of 29, I lost everything. My daughter died in a riot, my wife publicly revealed her lover and filed for divorce, and her wealthy family scorned me and threw me out of the house. I thought my life had hit the depths of tragedy. Until my 30th birthday, when a letter from my father, who had taken his own life 12 years earlier, arrived in my hands. In it, he revealed a secret that both pained me and made me smile, because I knew the chance for my final counterstrike had finally come. Hello, my name is Maximus Vaughn, but people usually don't call me by my full name. In the impoverished town where I grew up, they just called me Max. A short, unremarkable name, much like my childhood life. Quiet, unassuming, and filled with shadows I could never fully comprehend. I was born in a remote town in the Midwest of the United States where endless cornfields stretched out, interspersed with a few dusty red dirt roads. The town, probably not even worth marking on a map, consisted of just a few hundred households, a single grocery store, a small church, and an old bar where people gathered to forget their poverty. My home was on the outskirts of town, a dilapidated wooden house with a rusty tin roof that creaked every time the winter winds blew through. To me, that house wasn't just a place to live, it was a cage, trapping memories I both wanted to forget and couldn't let go of. My mother passed away when I was very young, just 5 years old. I don't remember much about her, only fleeting fragments. The faint scent of her perfume, her soft humming at night, and the warm hand that stroked my hair before bed. But those fragments were never enough to form a complete picture. She left this world under circumstances I still don't fully understand. My father never spoke much about it. Whenever I asked, he would just stare silently out the window, his sunken eyes holding an ocean of pain. Once I overheard neighbors whispering that my mother's death was not clear, that there was something suspicious about it, but no one dared say it aloud. Those whispers, like cold drafts slipping through a crack in the door, planted seeds of unease in my heart. After my mother's death, my father, already a man of few words, became almost mute. He worked at a lumber mill a few miles from town, leaving early in the morning and returning late at night. In the evenings, he would sit alone in an old armchair, holding a beer, staring blankly at the empty wall. I didn't know what he was thinking, but I could feel the loneliness radiating from him, like a pungent odor permeating the air of the house. As a 5 or 6-year-old boy, I would sit quietly in a corner of the room pretending to play with cheap toys, but really waiting for something. Maybe a hug, a word, anything to make me feel I wasn't invisible. Though my father was reserved, he still showed me a small corner of care in his own way. On weekends, he would take me into the forest to an old wooden cabin nestled deep among dense pine trees. To me, that cabin was another world. It was small, with just enough room for a wooden table, an old fireplace, and a few shelves stacked with hunting gear. The smell of damp wood, dried pine needles, and smoke from the fireplace blended together, creating a scent I still remember vividly, even after all these years. There, my father taught me how to hold a hunting rifle, how to track animal footprints, how to build a fire. Those moments were rare but precious. They were the times I felt closest to him, even though he still didn't say much. Occasionally, he would look at me, give a faint smile, and say something brief like, "Watch your step, Max," or "Hold the gun steady." I didn't need more than that. His presence was enough for me. But that small world where it was just me and my father didn't last forever. When I was 18, everything fell apart. It was a freezing autumn evening, the wind howling through the cracks in the house. I had just come back from a part-time job, exhausted and hungry. I called out to my father, but there was no response. The house was eerily silent. I walked into his room and then I saw him. My father was lying on the bed, eyes closed, hands limp, next to an empty bottle of pills and a folded note. My heart seemed to stop. Trembling, I opened the note and saw a few scrawled lines. "Live on strongly, Max." I'm sorry. I didn't cry right then. I stood there, staring at my father, at the note, feeling like the world was crumbling into pieces. I didn't understand why he did it, why he left me behind. All I knew was that from that moment I was an orphan, completely alone. My father, the quiet man I had relied on, had chosen to leave this world, leaving me with a note that explained nothing. After his death, I was like a wounded animal trudging through life. That small town with its pitying glances and whispers became suffocating. I had no close friends. I was always Max, the quiet kid, the strange boy living in the old house with the odd father. I didn't blame them, but I also didn't want to get close to anyone. The wounds in my heart, from my mother's death to my father's departure, had built an invisible wall around me. I didn't know how to open up, how to trust. Whenever someone tried to talk to me, I would nod, give a faint smile, and find a way to retreat. I was afraid that if I let someone into my world, I would lose them, just as I had lost my mother, then my father. In the years that followed, I lived like a shadow. I took on odd jobs to survive, delivering newspapers, cleaning at the bar, helping out at the lumber mill where my father once worked. But inside me, a small flame burned quietly, urging me to leave this place. I didn't want to be trapped forever in that town full of painful memories. I wanted to find another path, another life, even if I didn't know where it would lead. My father's note, "Live on strongly," became a mantra, a reminder etched into my mind. I didn't fully understand its meaning, but I knew I had to keep going, if only to prove I wouldn't surrender to fate. The cabin in the woods remained my refuge whenever life became too overwhelming. I would sit there alone by the fireplace, watching the flames flicker, trying to recapture some memory of the days when my father was still with me. Once I thought I heard his voice, low and steady, carried by the wind. "There it is, a wild boar, Max." I laughed, but then tears welled up. I didn't know if I was crying for my father, my mother, or myself. An 18-year-old kid carrying too many scars and no idea how to heal them. That town, that house, that cabin shaped who I am. I grew up with loneliness as a constant companion, with unanswered questions about my mother, my father, and my own life. I didn't know that those dark years were only the beginning of a longer, more secretive, and more painful story waiting for me ahead. Time passed, and when I turned 19, I packed a few old clothes, gathered the meager savings from my odd jobs, and left the town. I didn't look back. The wooden house, the red dirt roads, and even the cabin in the woods all felt like a distant dream I left behind, carrying only a heavy backpack and my father's letter. I had no clear plan, only a burning need for a fresh start, somewhere no one knew me as Max, the orphan boy living in the shadow of his past. I chose Chicago, a big, noisy city where I thought I could blend into the crowd and begin anew. I enrolled in a community college studying information technology. Technology to me was a safe haven. Code, data, systems. They were logical, emotionless, and non-judgmental. I spent hours in the computer lab typing, debugging, and building small programs. There, I didn't need to talk or explain who I was. I just needed to do my job well. After 4 years, I graduated with a decent degree and landed a job at a major tech corporation in Chicago, Grayson Enterprises. My role was simple, a low-level IT employee tucked away in a small basement office, checking network systems, patching software bugs, and handling technical requests from other departments. I liked the quiet of the job. I could put on headphones, focus on the screen, and become nearly invisible among the hundreds of other employees. My colleagues barely noticed me, and I didn't try to stand out. I just wanted to work, get paid, and live a life without waves. But fate, as if mocking me, had other plans. One late afternoon, while I was troubleshooting a frozen server, she walked into the IT room. Elizabeth Grayson, the only daughter of the company's chairman, William Grayson. I had heard of her. Truth be told, everyone probably had. She was the queen of Grayson Enterprises, beautiful, confident, always dressed in expensive outfits with a smile that made heads turn. She came to ask me to recover a lost file from her personal laptop. I still remember the flustered feeling, stumbling over my words, trying to avoid her striking blue eyes that made my heart skip a beat. Elizabeth smiled, thanked me in a gentle voice, and left. I thought it was just a fleeting moment, nothing more. But she came back, again and again. Sometimes to fix a printer, other times to ask about new software. Our brief exchanges gradually grew longer. I started to realize Elizabeth wasn't like the rumors. She wasn't arrogant or distant. She was curious about me, about the code I wrote, about the technical books on my desk. One day she invited me for coffee after work, and I, a quiet IT guy from a nowhere town, agreed without quite knowing why. We started dating secretly like two thieves in the gleaming halls of Grayson Enterprises. I knew I didn't belong in Elizabeth's world. She grew up in luxury, studied abroad in Europe, lived in penthouses with cityscape views. I was just a small-town guy with worn-out shoes and a past full of scars. But with her, I felt alive, truly alive for the first time since my father's death. Elizabeth made me laugh, made me forget the long nights alone in my cramped rented apartment. She shared her dreams of breaking free from her family's shadow, and I told her small stories about my town. Though I always avoided mentioning my mother, my father, or the dark corners of my heart. 6 months later, I knelt in a small park at sunset and proposed to her with a cheap ring I'd saved months of paychecks to buy. Elizabeth cried, nodded, and hugged me tightly. I thought it was the happiest moment of my life. But happiness, it turns out, always comes with a price. Our marriage happened quickly, almost unexpectedly. A small ceremony with just family and close friends, but the news spread like wildfire through Grayson Enterprises. The IT guy married the chairman's daughter. I overheard the whispers behind my back, the curious glances tinged with envy and disdain. I tried not to care. I just wanted to build a life with Elizabeth, a home I'd never had. But her family, especially her father, William Grayson, didn't accept me easily. He was a tall man with salt and pepper hair, always in tailored suits, exuding an authority that made others bow. The first time I met him in his expansive top-floor office, he sized me up with a cold stare. "This guy," he said to Elizabeth as if I weren't there, "he's got nothing but a few lines of code." Elizabeth defended me, but I saw the disappointment in his eyes. To him, I was unworthy, a small-town nobody daring to climb too high. In the years after our wedding, I tried to fit into her family. I attended lavish parties, stood beside Elizabeth in borrowed suits, forced smiles through probing questions from her friends and relatives. But each time I felt smaller. Elizabeth's mother, an elegant but icy woman, always called me the IT guy with a mocking smile. Her cousins were blunter, asking about life in the sticks as if I were some exotic creature. And William never missed a chance to remind me of my roots. "You should be grateful to be here, Max," he said at one dinner, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "Not everyone gets to step into this world." I swallowed those words, trying for Elizabeth's sake. She was my light, the reason I woke up each morning. We had a daughter, Isabel, a little angel with blonde hair and eyes just like her mother's. Every time I looked at Isabel, I told myself I had to be strong, to endure for her, for the small family I'd long dreamed of. But deep down, the Graysons' disdain pierced me like shards of glass. I felt I didn't belong, not in their lavish rooms, not in their conversations about money and power. I was just Max, the guy from a nowhere town, carrying scars no one could see. I worked hard, slowly climbing the ranks in the IT department, but I knew I'd always be an outsider in their eyes. Every night lying beside Elizabeth, I wondered if she was truly happy with me or just proving something to her family. I didn't dare ask, afraid of the answer. All I knew was that even with Isabel and Elizabeth, I still felt lonely, like I was still that 18-year-old boy standing in the wooden house, staring at my father's lifeless body next to an empty pill bottle. Those years I lived like a tightrope walker, trying to balance my love for Elizabeth, the joy of Isabel's smiles, and the invisible daggers from her family. Every time Isabel ran into my arms calling "Daddy," in her clear, bright voice, I felt every wound was worth enduring. She was only 4, with golden hair and eyes as blue as her mother's, but her smile was mine. Shy, sincere, I would spend hours with her, reading stories, building wooden block castles, or simply watching her sleep, silently vowing to give her a better life than I'd ever had. But fate, like a cruel jester, never let me rest. When I was 29, tragedy struck, a storm that swept away everything I cherished. It was a Tuesday, the Chicago sky gray and drizzling. I was in the office fixing a crashed system when my phone rang. A trembling stranger's voice delivered news from Isabel's preschool. A riot, they called it that, but I later learned it was a targeted attack. An armed stranger had stormed in, unleashing chaos. And Isabel, my little girl, became a victim, gone forever. She lay there in the school hallway, small and fragile, when I rushed to her side, met only by cold silence. I don't remember if I screamed or stood frozen. All I recall is the feeling of my heart being torn apart, the world collapsing beneath my feet. I held Isabel, her body already cold. I broke down, crying like never before, as if all the pain from my mother's death, my father's death, surged out at once. I called her name, begged her to open her eyes, but Isabel didn't answer. My little girl, my only light, was gone forever. I hoped Elizabeth would be my anchor as I had been hers. I thought that despite her family's contempt, despite the cracks in our marriage, we could face this loss together. I needed her, needed us to hold hands, to grieve, to hurt, and to rise again for Isabel. But I was wrong. Elizabeth, the woman I loved, the one I thought was my destiny, turned her back on me in the cruelest way. Just weeks after Isabel's funeral, Elizabeth grew distant. She avoided my eyes, my touch. I thought she was grieving like me, so I tried to be patient, to comfort her. But one evening, returning to our apartment, I found her on the sofa next to a stranger. He wore an expensive suit and a smug smile. He was her lover. Elizabeth looked at me, her eyes devoid of remorse, and said, "We should end this, Max. I've filed for divorce." I stood there like a fool, unable to believe what I heard. Divorce? After losing our daughter when I needed her most? I wanted to scream, to ask why, but my voice caught in my throat. She continued, her tone flat like reciting a speech. "You don't belong in this world, Max. You never did." I looked at the woman I loved and realized she was no longer my Elizabeth. She was a Grayson, backed by her wealthy family, and I was just an unwanted remnant. The next day, I received a termination letter from Grayson Enterprises. It was brief, cold, signed by William Grayson, my father-in-law. He didn't need to meet me, didn't need to explain. To him, I was a stain to be erased. I lost my job, my wife, and soon my home. The apartment, the car, even our joint bank account, all were in the Graysons' name. I had nothing left but a few clothes and a shattered heart. Within a month, I lost everything. Isabel, Elizabeth, my job, my dignity, and the roof over my head. I was no longer Maximus Vaughn, husband, father, or IT employee. I was just a failure, mercilessly beaten down by life. Standing in Chicago, the city that once promised a fresh start, I felt smaller than ever. I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Then a thought flickered in my mind like a frail flame in a storm. The old wooden house where I grew up, where my father lived and died. It was the only place left, the only place I could return to. I gathered what little remained, a backpack, a few $100s, and my father's letter, and boarded a bus leaving Chicago behind. The journey back to my old town took 12 hours, but to me it felt like a lifetime. I stared out the window, the endless cornfields reminding me of childhood, but now they only weighed me down. When the bus stopped at the final station, the town appeared before me, barely changed. The same red dirt roads, the same old grocery store, the same bar where people gathered to forget their poverty. But for me, everything was different. I was no longer the quiet boy Max. I was a man carrying new scars, deeper and more painful. The wooden house still stood at the town's edge, but it was even more dilapidated than I remembered. The rusty metal roof creaked, a window was broken, and weeds choked the yard. I pushed open the door, the smell of damp wood and dust hitting me, dragging with it a flood of childhood memories. I dropped my backpack, collapsed onto the floor, and let those memories wash over me like a deluge. I didn't cry, but I felt an endless void in my chest. I had lost everything. Isabel, my light. Elizabeth, the woman I loved. And myself, the man who once dreamed of a better life. This house, though moldy and haunted, was the only place left. I found some peace in its silence, but deep down I knew I was a failure. Life had knocked me down, not once, but time and again. Lying on the cold wooden floor, staring at the cobwebbed ceiling, I asked myself, "Dad, what does it mean to live on strongly when I have nothing left to live for?" Those days in the town, I lived like a ghost. I didn't go out, didn't talk to anyone. The townsfolk, familiar faces from my childhood, sometimes knocked on the door, bringing food or asking a few polite questions. But I knew they looked at me with pity. Max, the guy who returned from the city empty-handed, without a wife, a child, or a future. I didn't blame them. I just wanted to be left alone, to sink into the silence of the house, where memories of my father, my mother, and Isabel lingered like faint shadows. My 30th birthday arrived quietly. No cake, no candles, no well wishes. I sat alone in my father's old armchair, a beer in hand, staring out the window. A light rain fell, draping the town in a misty haze. I thought of Isabel, her radiant smile, the way she'd tug my hand to show me a wildflower. I thought of Elizabeth, her cold eyes as she spoke of divorce. And I thought of my father, his brief note, his final words. Live on strongly. I asked myself once again, what was the point of being strong when everything I loved had vanished? Then, as if by fate, a postal van pulled up to the house. The mail carrier, an old man with silver hair, knocked and handed me an aged, yellowed envelope. "Delivered right on your birthday, Max," he said in a low voice. My heart pounded as I took the envelope. The handwritten address was painfully familiar. My father's handwriting. I thanked the old man and sat down, my hands trembling as I opened it. Inside was a letter, its paper yellowed but the words sharp, as if my father had written them yesterday. "Max, my son," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means you've survived. You've been strong as I always hoped. I'm sorry for leaving you, for not giving you a complete childhood. There are secrets I carried my whole life, secrets I couldn't share while I was alive. But now, it's time for you to know. Go to the place where we bonded, where we shared those rare but precious moments. You'll find answers there. Be careful, Max. And please forgive me." I read the letter over and over, each word piercing my heart. The place where we bonded? I knew it was the wooden cabin in the woods where my father taught me to hold a rifle, to build a fire, where he gave me his rare smiles. But what secrets? What had he hidden there? I stood up, a surge of energy coursing through me. Despite my exhaustion, despite the grief weighing on my mind, I knew I had to go. I needed answers, needed to understand why he left this letter, why he chose to leave me. I grabbed an old jacket, a flashlight, and stepped out. The path to the woods was as it always was, narrow, covered in dry pine needles. Night had fallen, the air biting cold, but I felt nothing but an urgent pull. The forest was pitch black, with only the wind whistling through the trees and the faint beam of my flashlight guiding the way. The cabin appeared before me, still small and weathered, but to me, it was a doorway to the past. I pushed open the door, the smell of damp wood and dried leaves hitting me, pulling me back to the days when my father was still here. I searched every corner of the cabin, desperate for any trace of the secret my father mentioned. Nothing. Finally, I knelt on the wooden floor, checking each plank carefully. I tapped, felt, pulled until one plank in the corner creaked. My heart raced. I pried it open, dust billowing around me. Beneath it, I found it, a small, rusted safe hidden in a hollow in the earth. It wasn't large, but it was heavy, secured with an old combination lock. I tried numbers. My birthday, my father's birthday, the day my mother died. But none worked. Then I tried the day my father took his life, the day I lost him forever. Click. The lock sprang open. I lifted the lid, my breath catching. Inside were stacks of cash, tightly bound with rubber bands, alongside gleaming gold bars under the flashlight's beam. I estimated it must be worth around $5 million. But what stunned me more was a thick file, next to a stack of old photographs and another letter, also in my father's handwriting. I sat on the floor, my hands shaking as I opened the file. Pages filled with handwritten notes, copies of contracts, transaction lists, and photos of unfamiliar men, cars, and places I didn't recognize. I set the file aside and opened the letter. My father's handwriting, so familiar yet so painful, cut into my heart like a dagger. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but each line pulled me into an abyss I hadn't known existed. Max, my son. The letter began, its tone heavy with sorrow, as if my father were sitting before me, speaking his final words. If you're reading this, you've found the safe. You've touched the secret I've kept buried my whole life. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I beg you to listen, to understand what I did and why I chose to leave. I paused, my hands gripping the letter tightly. Part of me wanted to tear it apart, to forget everything, but another part deep inside yearned for the truth. I kept reading, each word striking my mind like a hammer. I was once a different man. Before you were born, before your mother came into my life, I took a wrong path. I worked for a criminal organization, a network whose name you shouldn't know. I wasn't a gunman, not a killer, but I was part of it, laundering money, hiding transactions, doing things I knew were wrong. I thought I could control it, that I could walk away when I wanted, but that world never lets anyone go. My throat tightened. My father, the quiet man who taught me to build a fire in the cabin, part of a criminal underworld? I pictured him with his sad eyes, sitting in dark rooms dealing with dangerous men. The image felt foreign yet painfully real because I knew he wasn't lying. This letter was the truth, raw and ruthless. Then your mother came along, the letter continued. She was my light, the reason I wanted to change. When you were born, I decided to betray the organization. I became an informant for the police, feeding them information to dismantle the network. I thought I could save your mother, save our family. But I was wrong. They found out. Your mother, they killed her to punish me. It wasn't an accident, Max. It was my fault. I stopped, tears streaming down my face. My mother, whom I only remembered through fleeting fragments, her perfume, her humming, her warm hand, died because of my father? I wanted to be angry, to scream, but I couldn't. I only felt pain, a deep, searing pain, as if I'd lost her all over again. I forced myself to keep reading, though each word stung like salt in a wound. I was lucky to escape with my life, and I did everything to save you. We were placed in a witness protection program. That's why we came to this remote town, living a hidden life. I cut off all contact with the outside world. No friends, no family, just you and me. I wanted to give you a safe life, but I know I failed. I let you grow up in loneliness, starved of affection. I couldn't give you a complete family, and that tormented me every day. I thought of my childhood years, the cold wooden house, the evenings when my father sat silently with a beer, his eyes empty. He wasn't just grieving my mother. He was carrying the weight of guilt, the pain of a man living with a secret too big to bear. I began to understand why he was so quiet, why he kept his distance. It wasn't because he didn't love me, but because he was afraid. Afraid the past would catch up. Afraid I'd get hurt. The money and gold in the safe, he wrote, are the slush fund I took from the organization before I fled. I called it my survival insurance, to ensure you'd have a future even if I wasn't there. When you turned 18, I knew you'd grown strong enough to stand on your own. I chose to leave, Max. Not because I didn't love you, but because I couldn't live with the pain of losing your mother, or with the guilt of dragging her into the darkness. I thought by leaving I'd free you from the shadow of my past. But now I leave you with this truth and a choice. You can keep the money, live a wealthy, carefree life. Or you can face the truth, though it will be painful. The decision is yours. I believe in you, Max. I folded the letter, my mind in chaos. I was both furious and heartbroken. Furious that my father had walked a criminal path, that he let my mother die, that he raised me in a lie. But heartbroken too, because I understood his sacrifice. He lived his life in guilt and pain to protect me. He chose death so I could live, even if that life was scarred. I clutched the letter to my chest, tears falling onto the cold wooden floor of the cabin. I wanted to scream, to ask him why, but only silence answered. I looked at the cash and gold in the safe glinting under the flashlight's beam. $5 million. Enough to rebuild my life, to leave this town, to forget the pain. I could buy a new house, a new job, a life free of suffering. But then I glanced at the file, its pages brimming with secrets, and I knew I couldn't turn away. The truth, as my father said, couldn't stay buried forever. But facing it meant what? Digging up the past, reopening old wounds, and perhaps confronting those who killed my mother? I sat there in the wooden cabin in the dead of night, caught between two extremes. On one side, safety, wealth, a new life free of pain. On the other, the truth fraught with danger and hurt. But the only way to understand my father, my mother, and myself. I thought of Isabel, her smile, how she made me feel worthy. I thought of Elizabeth, her betrayal, and the Graysons who trampled me. And I thought of my father, his final letter, his words, "I believe in you, Max." I didn't sleep that night. I carried the safe back to the wooden house, carefully stashing it under the bed. I reread the letter again and again until the words were etched into my mind. I didn't know what I'd do with the money, the file, or the truth my father left behind. But one thing I knew. I couldn't run away. Not this time. In the days that followed, I lived like a man possessed. I locked the door of the wooden house, drew the curtains tight, and spread the file across the old kitchen table. The yellowed pages, handwritten notes, copies of contracts, financial transaction lists, and a stack of photographs. All were like a doorway to a world I never wanted to know. I read every page, every line, every number, trying to make sense of what my father had left behind. Each sheet was a puzzle piece, and I, like a determined solver, began piecing them together, though each fragment tightened the knot in my chest. At first, I saw only unfamiliar names and numbers. Shell companies, offshore bank accounts, multi-million-dollar transactions cleverly disguised. My father's handwritten notes were brief but chilling. Transfer $2 million via Cayman Islands. Or meet R at the docks, deliver goods 9 p.m. I didn't fully understand, but I could feel the danger radiating from those words. The photographs sent shivers down my spine. Men in expensive suits standing beside sleek black cars, their eyes cold and sharp. Warehouses filled with wooden crates, and hazy locations like docks or abandoned storage facilities. Then a name appeared in the file over and over. Grayson Enterprises. I thought I'd misread it. Grayson Enterprises, the corporation owned by my father-in-law, William Grayson, where I had worked. My heart pounded as I flipped through the pages. The subsidiaries, projects, and investment funds listed in the file, I recognized them. I'd glimpsed these names in data files during my time at the company, but back then, I thought they were just routine projects of a massive corporation. Now, reading my father's notes, I understood. They weren't business ventures. They were fronts, branches of a money laundering and violent criminal network my father had been entangled in. I sank into a chair, my mind reeling. The criminal organization my father betrayed, the one that killed my mother, wasn't some nameless syndicate. It was tied to Grayson Enterprises, hidden beneath the polished facade of skyscrapers, billion-dollar contracts, and the Grayson family's prestigious reputation. And at the helm, orchestrating it all, was none other than William Grayson, my father-in-law, the man who looked at me with contempt, who fired me, who stood behind the collapse of my life. I flipped through the photos again, examining each one closely. In an old picture taken at a dock, I saw him. William Grayson, younger, his hair not yet streaked with gray, but those cold, unmistakable eyes. He stood next to another man, likely the boss my father mentioned in his letter. I trembled, not from the cold, but from the rage and horror surging within me. Every loss in my life, my mother's murder, my father's suicide, my broken family, traced back to this man. He wasn't just a father-in-law who despised my humble origins. He was the architect of my mother's death, the force that drove my father to despair, and quite possibly the one indirectly responsible for taking Isabel, for destroying the life I'd fought to build. I stood and paced the wooden house, trying to suppress my anger. I wanted to punch the walls, to scream, to confront William Grayson immediately. But I knew I couldn't act rashly. I needed to think, to understand more. I returned to the table, diving back into the file, each page like another stab wound. Financial records showed millions funneled through Grayson Enterprises' subsidiaries, matching projects I'd seen on the company's servers. My father's handwritten notes detailed how he gathered evidence, secretly documenting meetings and transactions for the police. But the cost of his betrayal was my mother's life, and his own. I was torn. Part of me wanted to burn the file, take the money and gold from the safe, and disappear. I could forget the past, forget William Grayson, forget the pain that had shredded my heart. But then my father's words echoed, impossible to ignore. The truth cannot stay buried forever. I thought of my mother, her faint memories, her perfume, her humming, her warm hand. I thought of my father, his years of solitude, carrying guilt and pain. And I thought of Isabel, my only light, whom I'd never hold again. I couldn't turn away, not because I was brave, but because I couldn't live knowing I'd chosen cowardice. William Grayson, his family, and their criminal network had to pay. Not just for my mother, for my father, but for me. For Maximus Vaughn, a man battered by life but still standing, scarred, heart and all. I decided to take the harder path, turn the entire file over to the police. I knew it would spark a legal battle, one where I, a quiet IT guy, would face a powerful family. But I had nothing left to lose. I'd lost my mother, my father, Isabel, Elizabeth, my dignity. All I had was the truth, and I would use it to seek justice. The money and gold in the safe I left untouched under the bed. I didn't know what to do with them yet. To me, they weren't just wealth. They were my father's legacy, tainted by crime yet born of his sacrifice to protect me. Every time I looked at them, I saw him, his pain, and the love he never spoke aloud. I couldn't touch them. Not yet, not while I carried the mission he'd left me. I sat down and wrote a meticulous plan. I knew William Grayson wasn't an easy foe. He had money, power, and a network ready to crush anyone who dared oppose him. But I wasn't afraid. Not because I was strong, but because I had nothing left to fear. I knew that if I wanted to bring down William Grayson and his criminal empire, I had to be meticulous. One wrong move and I'd become the next target, like my mother, like my father. But I couldn't back down. My father's words from the letter echoed in my mind. The truth cannot stay buried forever. I spent days organizing the file, sorting it into neat stacks. I copied every page, every note, every photograph, handling them with the care of an archaeologist preserving priceless artifacts. I used an old scanner I found in a corner of the house, a relic my father once used to store documents. Each time the scanner groaned, a surge of adrenaline coursed through me. This wasn't just copying papers. It was the first step in my war. With the IT skills that had once earned me a living at Grayson Enterprises, I knew how to cover my tracks. I set up a simple but effective encryption system using an old laptop I bought from a secondhand shop in town. I created an anonymous email account, unlinked to any personal information, and sent the scanned documents to 3 recipients: the FBI, the Chicago Police Department, and an investigative journalist I found online, known for exposing corporate scandals. In the email, I included a brief note: evidence of criminal activity by Grayson Enterprises. Originals are securely stored. Investigate. I also provided vague instructions about the original's location, a post office box in a nearby town, to ensure that if anyone came looking, they wouldn't find me immediately. I hit send, my heart pounding. The screen flickered, then displayed sent. Sitting in the moldy wooden house, I felt like I'd just dropped a bomb on Chicago. I knew there was no turning back. William Grayson wouldn't sit idly by. He'd hunt for the traitor, and even though I was anonymous, I'd face danger. In the days that followed, I barely left the house. I followed the news on an old TV and through the town's weak internet connection. Just a week later, the story broke. A first article appeared with a sensational headline: Grayson Enterprises' billion-dollar empire or criminal front. It cited leaked documents exposing shady financial transactions, shell companies, and ties to illegal activities. William Grayson's name was mentioned, not as a successful businessman, but as a suspect in a long-standing criminal network. I sat in front of the TV, gripping a beer bottle, watching William Grayson on the evening news. He stepped out of a building surrounded by reporters, his eyes as cold as ever but betraying a hint of tension. "No comment," he repeated, but I caught the tremor in his voice, something I'd never heard from the man who always seemed in control. Online articles and comments spread like wildfire, branding Grayson Enterprises a criminal empire and demanding a thorough investigation. The Grayson family plunged into crisis. I read about emergency meetings and internal disputes. Elizabeth, my ex-wife, appeared in a brief article, looking more haggard than I'd ever seen her. She was no longer the queen of Grayson Enterprises, just a woman caught in the storm. I didn't feel vindicated, but I didn't feel pity either. She'd made her choice when she betrayed me, siding with her family. Meanwhile, William Grayson fought back. I heard he hired a top-tier legal team claiming the leaked documents were fabricated, a plot by competitors. But I knew the truth. The pages in my father's file couldn't be so easily dismissed. They were the result of years of him risking his life to document transactions and meetings for the police. And now they were shaking the empire William Grayson had built. I knew he was hunting for the traitor. An article mentioned Grayson Enterprises hiring private investigators to trace the leak's source. A chill ran down my spine. I'd been careful, but William Grayson was no ordinary man. He had money, power, and ruthlessness. I double-checked the locks on the house, secured every window, and kept the flashlight by my side each night. I wasn't afraid of dying. I'd lost too much to fear that. But I wanted to live at least long enough to see justice served. From the wooden house, I quietly observed everything. I watched the news, read articles, and tracked the investigation's progress. Each day, the legal noose tightened around William Grayson. His subsidiaries' accounts were frozen, witnesses began speaking out, and the FBI launched an official investigation. I knew my first strike had hit its mark, but this was only the beginning. This war wouldn't be easy, and William Grayson wouldn't go down without a fight. I knew there was no turning back. William Grayson wouldn't stop until he found me, or until he was brought down. But I was ready. From this moldy wooden house in this remote town, I, Maximus Vaughn, would carry on the mission my father left behind, and I wouldn't stop until the truth was fully exposed. After the scanned files were exposed to the public, I turned the old wooden house into my own fortress. I didn't go out, didn't talk to anyone. The townsfolk, accustomed to my quiet nature since childhood, hardly noticed. Occasionally, the old mail carrier or the grocery store owner would knock, bringing food or asking a few questions, but I responded briefly, just enough to avoid suspicion. I didn't want anyone to know what I was doing, didn't want any eyes to glimpse the secret I held. Within weeks of the leak, the storm grew fiercer. Investigative agencies moved with dizzying speed. The FBI announced an expanded investigation into Grayson Enterprises, with allegations of money laundering, smuggling, and ties to organized crime. Articles flooded the news with sensational headlines. Is the Grayson Empire crumbling? The dark secrets behind Grayson Enterprises' glamour. Each article was a dagger into the empire William Grayson had built, and from this wooden house I felt every stab. The corporation's reputation plummeted. Grayson Enterprises' stock, once at the peak of a billion-dollar company, crashed to record lows. Major shareholders who had once hailed William Grayson as a business genius began to flee. Partners, big companies that had signed multi-million-dollar contracts, cut ties, citing ethical concerns. Employees were in disarray. Some quit, others publicly criticized the leadership. I read about emergency meetings and heated disputes within the Grayson family. Elizabeth, my ex-wife, was hounded by the press but refused interviews. In a candid photo, I saw her leaving a building, her hair disheveled, her eyes weary. She was no longer the confident woman who stood beside me at lavish parties. She was now just a fragment of the storm I had unleashed. William Grayson, once a towering figure of power, became the focal point of scrutiny. I watched the evening news as he appeared before cameras, leaving a courthouse surrounded by his legal team. But he was no longer the William Grayson I knew. He looked older, his shoulders slightly hunched, his face etched with wrinkles, and his eyes, though still trying to project authority, betrayed anger and exhaustion. He shouted into reporters' microphones, "This is a filthy conspiracy. I'll prove it's all fabricated." But his voice trembled, and I knew he was grasping at the power slipping through his fingers. I kept watching. The Grayson family was fracturing. One article mentioned Elizabeth's mother, the elegant woman who once mocked me as the IT guy, trying to sell off shares to salvage their wealth. Elizabeth's cousins turned on each other, arguing over who was to blame for the scandal. And Elizabeth, in a rare moment on television, appeared haggard, refusing to answer questions about her father. Each day I documented the developments, like a soldier on a battlefield keeping a journal. I knew William Grayson wouldn't fall easily. He had money, connections, and ruthlessness. But I also knew the truth, once unleashed, couldn't be buried again. My father's documents, the evidence he risked his life to gather, were doing their work. They were the spark I had ignited, and that fire was spreading, consuming the Grayson empire. The months that followed were a long, tense, and dramatic wait. From the moldy wooden house, I tracked every move of the investigation. The FBI and Chicago police dug deep into the documents I'd sent, tearing apart every corner of Grayson Enterprises. New witnesses emerged, former employees, old associates of William Grayson, breaking the wall of silence. They spoke of secret meetings, funds funneled through offshore accounts, and threats to keep secrets buried. Each testimony was another blow to Grayson's empire, and I, though a shadow in the dark, felt the weight of every strike. The trial finally took place after nearly a year, broadcast live across news channels. I sat in front of the TV, clutching a cold beer, my eyes glued to the screen. William Grayson, once a titan of power, appeared in an ill-fitting suit, his face gaunt, his eyes burning with anger but betraying desperation. He faced a litany of charges: money laundering, organized crime, and indirect involvement in multiple acts of violence, including my mother's death. His associates, from high-ranking executives to shadowy operatives, couldn't escape the legal net either. The verdict came: life in prison for William Grayson, along with an order to seize all his assets and those of his accomplices. Grayson Enterprises, once a symbol of success, officially collapsed. Its name was now a stain in the public's eyes. The Grayson family fell apart. Articles detailed the rifts within. Elizabeth's mother, the elegant woman who once mocked me, sold off her remaining shares to pay debts and retreated from public life. Elizabeth's cousins, who had sneered at my humble roots, turned on each other, suing over scraps of the remaining wealth. And Elizabeth, my ex-wife, once a light in my darkest years, became the subject of gossip. Her lover, the man in the expensive suit, abandoned her as soon as the scandal broke. She appeared in the press, no longer the queen of Grayson Enterprises, but a haggard woman living in disgrace, shunned by society. Sitting in the wooden house, watching the final news reports about the trial, I felt a strange emptiness. Justice had been served. William Grayson, the man who killed my mother, drove my father to despair, and indirectly destroyed my family, was now behind bars. But I didn't feel victorious, not entirely. I only felt relief, as if an invisible burden had been lifted. I knew it was time to step out of the shadows. I couldn't stay hidden in this wooden house forever, living like a ghost. I needed to close the past, not to forget, but to move forward. And I knew I had to see Elizabeth, not to humiliate or seek revenge, but to say a final word, to free myself from the invisible chains still binding me to her. I took a bus back to Chicago after more than a year. The city was still noisy, still glittering with lights, but to me it was just a distant memory. I went to a small cafe where Elizabeth agreed to meet me after a brief message. When I walked in, I saw her in a corner wearing a simple sweater. no longer in expensive dresses or radiating her old glamour. She looked worn, her hair loosely tied, her once vivid blue eyes now dulled by exhaustion. When she looked up at me, I saw a flicker of surprise, then wariness. "Max," she said, her voice hoarse, "I didn't think you'd come." I sat across from her, saying nothing at first. The air between us was heavy, as if a lifetime weighed on our shoulders. I looked at her, the woman I once loved, once thought was my destiny. But now she was a stranger, someone who betrayed me when I needed her most. "Elizabeth," I began, my voice calm, "I'm not here to blame or humiliate you. I just want to say a final word so we can both close this chapter." She lowered her head, her hands tightening around her coffee cup. "I know I was wrong," she whispered. "I chose my family, the easy path, and I lost everything. I'm sorry, Max." I shook my head. "I don't hate you, Elizabeth. I just regret that you chose the wrong path. We had a family, we had Isabel, but you let it all fall apart." My words, though calm, cut like a knife. Elizabeth began to cry, not loud sobs, but silent tears streaming down her cheeks. I knew she wasn't crying because she still loved me, but because she realized the truth. She had destroyed everything. Her family, her love, herself. I looked at her, and for the first time I felt no pain, only relief, as if I'd just severed the final thread tying me to the past. I stood, leaving a few dollars on the table for my coffee. "I hope you find peace, Elizabeth," I said, my voice soft but firm. "I'll keep living, for Isabel, for my parents, and for myself." She didn't respond, just kept her head bowed, tears falling. I turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving the wreckage of the past behind. Outside, Chicago was still bustling, but I felt different. I was no longer Max, the small-town guy scorned by others, nor Maximus Vaughn, the man scarred by life. I was someone who had reclaimed himself, who had risen from the ashes of his life. I boarded a bus, leaving Chicago once more, returning to the remote town where I grew up. The red dirt roads, the sprawling cornfields, and the old wooden house appeared before me like a familiar painting. But this time I no longer saw it as a cage trapping painful memories. It was the place where I was born, where my parents once lived, where I lost so much, but also where I rediscovered myself. I pushed open the door, the smell of damp wood and dust unchanged, but this time I felt a hint of warmth, as if the house were welcoming me back. I pulled the safe from under the bed, opened its lid, and gazed at the stacks of cash and gleaming gold. $5 million, a sum that could change anyone's life. But to me, they were more than wealth. They were my father's legacy, forged in blood and tears, his sacrifice to secure my future. I touched the gold bars, feeling their coldness under my fingertips, and thought of all that had passed. Then I closed the safe and slid it back to its place. I wasn't ready to use the money, and perhaps I never would be. In the days that followed, I began fixing up the wooden house. I bought paint, a hammer, nails, and new planks from the town's hardware store. I patched the rusty tin roof, replaced broken window frames, and cleared the overgrown weeds in the yard. Each hammer strike, each coat of paint was a step toward healing. I wasn't rushing or trying to make the house grand. I just wanted it to be livable, a place I could call home. Those simple tasks brought me a peace I hadn't expected. Standing in the yard, wiping sweat from my brow, watching the house slowly take shape, I felt I was rebuilding not just a home, but my entire life. I started keeping a journal, a habit I'd never had before. Each evening I sat at the kitchen table under the dim glow of a yellow lamp, writing my journey. I didn't write to boast or seek sympathy. I wrote to unburden, to preserve the truth. And so that one day, if someone read these pages, they'd understand that justice, even if delayed, has the power to heal. As I wrote, I realized my victory wasn't in money or the satisfaction of seeing the Grayson family fall. My victory was in reclaiming my honor, my freedom, and breaking the cycle of guilt that spanned my parents' generation. I was no longer a failure, no longer the small-town boy scorned by others. I was Maximus Vaughn, A man who faced the darkness, rose from ruins, and chose to live with the truth. One autumn afternoon, as pine needles began to fall, I walked into the forest to the wooden cabin where my father and I had bonded. The cabin still stood small and weathered, but to me it was no longer a place of terrifying secrets. I stood at the door, gazing up at the deep blue sky, where the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, casting shimmering patches on the ground. I closed my eyes, feeling the cool breeze brush my face, and whispered, as if speaking to those I loved, "It's over. I'll live the rest of my life with truth and peace. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'll live. Not for money, not for revenge, but for the truth and resilience that pulled me from the wreckage." Sometimes justice comes late, but it still has the power to heal. Some losses can never be undone, but the truth, like the flame my father ignited, can light the way, guiding me to a better version of myself. I, Maximus Vaughn, am no longer a shadow of the past. I am a free man, and I will live, with truth, with peace, and with love for those who shaped who I am today.